guys, it's Jane. Welcome back to Mystery Monday. For today I've got a review. I'm going to be talking about the Mangle Street Murders by M.R.C. Kasasian. This is the first in the Gower Street Detective series and it's set in 1880s London. The two main characters are Sydney Grice, a personal detective, and March Middleton, his ward. The stories are all told from the point of view of March, and this book opens with March closing up her family home and getting on a train to go down to London to meet for the first time her godfather, who has written in the wake of her father's death to invite her to come to London to live with him. She's in her early 20s, unmarried. Her mother died in childbirth with her. She has no other close family, and so she's coming down to meet this man who fate has drawn her to. Before the story proper starts, we have an author's preface written in the person of March, speaking about Sydney in quite warm terms, which is just as well, because from the minute they meet, they're at each other's throats. They're very different people and they spit at each other like cats. And a lot of the progress of the story is actually driven by their conflict. So it's nice that in the back of your mind you can remember that at least at some point she grows to respect him at any rate. In this story, she's staying with him because she doesn't really feel like she financially has much alternative. But yeah, they really do not get along. So we have this gaslight detective murder mystery. So obviously Sherlock Holmes is a figure in the background in our minds, and that's not just in the background in the story. We get one or two sly nods in this direction. At one point in the story, March is attended by a doctor, and that doctor turns out to be a young Arthur Conan Doyle who has heard of Sydney Grice and thinks that his exploits might make interesting material for a story. Sydney Grice is also written up in the Penny Dreadfuls at the time during the story and is most put out by the way he is portrayed in the press, especially that he is referred to as a private detective, a term which he thinks is quite vulgar. So the actual mystery is the murder of a young woman for which her husband has been arrested. The murdered woman's mother, who believes in her son-in-law's innocence, comes to Sydney Grice asking him to take on the case. At this point, we discover that Sydney Grice is not a man who is moved by normal human emotion. And upon determining that Mrs. Dillinger, the mother-in-law, has no means to pay him, goes to turn him away. But March, who has just come into a small inheritance, is swayed by Mrs. Dillinger's appeals and decides to bankroll the investigation herself on the proviso that she gets to come along. And by virtue of this device, we have March, a young unmarried woman in Victorian England, being brought along to the crime scene and to the morgue and to the police cell where there's an interview with the suspect. And so hence the story. The tone of the book is quite light, although the subject matter is pretty dark. There's quite a lot of banter. Sydney Grice is painted as a pretty hateful individual. He's after money and he's vain. Quite late on in the piece, March confronts Sydney Grice about why he even invited her to come and stay with him. And it turns out, unsurprisingly by this point, that his motives were not altruistic. So we have a pretty unlikable central character. March, on the other hand, is drawn very, very sympathetically, which is just as well, because otherwise the book would be virtually unreadable. In a way, this book covers territory that is pretty well trodden. The mystery itself is nothing especially out of the ordinary, and the setting is nothing particularly new. However, The thing that struck me about this book is the psychological aspects. In fact, Sydney Grice has decided pretty much from the beginning that the man the police have arrested is in fact guilty. And March is convinced that he's innocent. And the tension in the story that keeps it interesting is that the evidence, as it's investigated, you go back and forth about who is actually in the right. As the reader, you're kept off balance. So if you're fond of a bit of Victoriana, a few handsome cabs, and a deeply cerebral but not particularly emotionally available detective, then the Mangle Street Murders might sort you out. The second book in this series is The Curse of the House of Foskett, wherein an eccentric member of a final death society dies on Sydney Grice's study floor, effectively drawing him into an investigation. And the third book in this series is due out in June. That's it for me today. I hope you're all well, and I'll talk to you later. Bye!